over more than 3 decades, Wesley Snipes has built a career that few action stars can match, not just with his powerful physique or masterful martial arts skills, but with a commanding on-screen presence that keeps audiences glued to the screen. He made his mark with diverse roles in New Jack City, White Men Can't Jump, and then Passenger 57, where the line, "Always bet on black," became a pop culture icon and reached his peak when he embodied Blade, the character who completely changed how Hollywood viewed superhero films, bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars in global box office revenue and paving the way for an entire cinematic empire to come. He wasn't just an actor, he was also a producer, a formally trained fighter with black belts in multiple disciplines, one of the pioneers who brought real-world combat martial arts into modern action cinema. And his career spanned hit films, iconic roles, and a status as one of the rare black stars who achieved genuine power in Hollywood at that time. An accomplishment that was not only personal, but carried historic weight for the entire industry. But behind all that spotlight lies a journey not everyone sees, where success came with pressure, where control gradually turned into isolation, and where wrong decisions began quietly piling up until they exploded, pulling him down from the heights he had worked so hard to climb. The prison sentence didn't just take his freedom, it erased his reputation, turning an icon into a forgotten name. And during those years, cut off from the world, he was forced to confront himself. No lights, no roles, just the real man and the unavoidable consequences. But even in that darkness, his will didn't completely break, as the discipline from martial arts, from those years of grueling training, became what kept him standing, helping him accept his mistakes, learn to start over from zero, and prove that even if a person can be knocked down, they can still choose not to disappear. If the story of Wesley Snipes' fall and his journey to rise again touches you deeply, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the profound stories behind Hollywood's glamour. But Wesley Snipes' story didn't begin under stage lights or with rounds of applause. It started in a place few in Hollywood want to mention, the South Bronx, New York. In the late 1960s and 1970s, when the area was drowning in poverty, violence, and endless instability, where crumbling buildings, trash-filled streets, and police sirens in the night became more familiar sounds than children's laughter. And for a boy like Wesley, the world wasn't defined by opportunity but by limits. His family wasn't wealthy. His mother was a teacher, a disciplined, strict woman who always tried to keep her son away from the traps of the surrounding environment, but in a place where everything could drag you down. Love and guidance sometimes weren't enough to make life easier, because the pressure to survive didn't come from one big event, but from every day, every hour, every wary glance you had to learn to read and respond to. Wesley didn't grow up carefree. He grew up observant, understanding even at a very young age that there were streets you shouldn't walk down, people you shouldn't trust, and situations where, if you weren't strong enough, you'd be swallowed whole before anyone noticed. His living space was like an invisible battlefield, where every child had to learn to defend themselves before learning to dream, where weakness wasn't forgiven, and innocence could become a fatal vulnerability. And it was in that environment that a near-instinctive defensive survival instinct took shape in him, making him guarded, cautious, and always trying to control everything around him, as if letting his guard down even a little would let the world rush in and shatter everything. He wasn't taught that life would be fair. He was taught that life was something you had to fight for every single piece of, and that lesson came too early, too heavily for a child. But it became the foundation for the man he would later become. While other kids could dream about the future, Wesley had to learn to survive in the present, to hold himself together in an environment that constantly tested his limits, and that created a painful paradox. The very things that helped him survive were also the things that gradually distanced him from the world, because when you're used to always being on defense, it becomes very hard to open up, very hard to trust, and very hard to let go of control. But at that time, all he knew was one simple, harsh truth, that if he wasn't strong enough, if he allowed himself to be weak, the world wouldn't hesitate to swallow him whole. And so that boy learned to stand tall, to endure, and to survive, even if it meant hiding the most fragile parts of himself. But amid a world where everything seemed perpetually out of control, Wesley Snipes found one rare place where he could master himself, the dojo, where every movement had meaning, every breath was controlled, and every mistake could be corrected through discipline. When he first started training in karate and later kung fu, it wasn't just about learning to fight. It was about learning to control an inner world stretched tight by outside pressures, where, for the first time in his life, he didn't have to stay alert to everything around him, didn't have to anticipate danger from glances or footsteps behind him, because in that space the rules were clear, the boundaries were clear, and effort was always rewarded fairly, something the outside world had never promised him. Martial arts became a language he could understand, a system he could trust, and above all, a place where he could rebuild the sense of safety his childhood had taken away. Every punch, every kick, every form wasn't just technique. It was how he released built-up tension, how he turned fear into strength and chaos into order, as if with every movement he was rewriting the rules of the world in a way he could control. Alongside martial arts, performing arts opened another door, a place where he didn't have to hide behind defenses but could become anyone, say things he didn't dare say in real life, express emotions he'd learned to suppress early on. The stage became another kind of freedom, where control wasn't for defense anymore, but for creation, for expression, and for connection, even if only for a fleeting moment. But it was the contrast between those two worlds, the chaotic, unpredictable, danger-filled life outside, and the clear, ordered rules of the dojo and the stage, that gradually built in him an ever stronger need for control, not just in training or performing, but in how he viewed life itself. As he began to believe that if he controlled things well enough, if he kept everything within bounds, nothing could hurt him. From a child learning to defend himself, he became a man learning to control every detail, from his body and emotions to his surroundings. And that made him strong, disciplined, and formidable. But it also made him increasingly closed off, less trusting of others, and reluctant to accept anything outside his plans. Control, which began as a tool for survival, gradually became part of his identity, an armor he never took off, even when it was no longer needed. And it was right there, during those years that seemed to be building the foundation for success, that the seeds of a future tragedy quietly took root. Because when a person believes they must control everything to feel safe, they also put themselves in a dangerous position, where just one thing slipping out of control can bring everything crashing down. But at that time, Wesley didn't see it. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he no longer felt powerless. And that feeling was so powerful, he was willing to hold on to it at any cost. Right from that sense of control, Wesley Snipes began to see a clearer path, for his life. Acting was no longer just a temporary escape, but became a serious choice, a road he had to follow all the way to the end, because it was the only place where he could both control himself and escape the harsh reality that had followed him since childhood. He studied the craft with discipline, training not just performance skills, but also how to command the camera, how to master emotions, how to turn painful experiences into depth for his characters. And there, he was no longer a kid from the Bronx, but a man trying to redefine himself. But that path was far from smooth, and harsh reality hit quickly when he entered the casting world, where talent alone isn't always enough, where brutal competition can make someone forgotten in seconds, and where rejections became so familiar they hurt. Wesley went from audition to audition, landing tiny roles that were almost invisible, roles where his name wasn't even remembered by audiences. And there were times he stood on the edge of his own dream, watching others step into the spotlight he believed he deserved. Each rejection wasn't just a professional setback, it was a blow to the belief he'd worked so hard to build. Because, for him, this wasn't an option he could try and quit. This was the only road, and if it failed, he didn't just lose a chance. He lost everything. Lost the chance to escape the past he'd fought so hard to leave behind. That pressure didn't come from outside, it came from deep inside him. From the fear of going back to the old life where he'd had to fight every day just to survive, where everything was unstable and nothing guaranteed he wouldn't be pulled under again. For Wesley, failure wasn't simply not succeeding yet. It was a step back toward the darkness he knew too well but never wanted to return to. That's why, deep down, a rock-hard conviction began to form, almost like an unspoken vow he carried in every decision, that he had to succeed, not for fame or money, but because he wouldn't allow himself to fail, wouldn't allow his life to be defined by where he started, and wouldn't allow all the effort, the discipline, the years of endurance to mean nothing. But that belief, as powerful and necessary as it was to push him forward, also carried a dangerous pressure inside it. Because when a person believes they have no way back, they'll do anything to move ahead, even push themselves to the limit, even ignore warning signs, even trade away things they might pay a very heavy price for later. But at that moment, all Wesley saw was one road ahead, and he walked it with every ounce of his will, no turning back, no hesitation, no allowing himself to stop. Because for him, stopping meant being swallowed whole, and that was something he'd sworn long ago would never happen. And then, after countless rejections and tiny roles that were practically invisible, the moment Wesley Snipes had been waiting for finally arrived. Not like some sudden miracle, but as the result of all the years of persistence and discipline he'd poured into this path. When he appeared in Spike Lee's Mo Better Blues, audiences started noticing a new face with emotional depth and a different kind of presence. Someone who didn't just act, but carried an inexplicable inner power. And then came New Jack City, where he played Nino Brown, a character who was both charismatic and terrifying, both in control and full of danger. And that role made Hollywood unable to ignore him any longer, because Wesley didn't just play a powerful man, he became that powerful man on screen, drawing viewers in and haunting them at the same time. For the first time in his life, the world truly saw him, not as someone trying to claw his way into the industry, but as a rising star, and doors began to open, offers came in, opportunities arrived, looks of recognition he'd only dreamed of before all flooded in at once, creating the feeling he'd chased for so long, the feeling of being acknowledged, being seen, being confirmed that everything he'd sacrificed was worth it. But what no one saw, not even those closest to him, was that the insecurity was still there, quiet but persistent, like a shadow that never left. Because when you've lived too long in the need to prove yourself, success doesn't bring instant peace. It sometimes adds even more pressure, as you start wondering how long you can hold this position, whether it can all vanish as quickly as it came. For Wesley, success wasn't the finish line, it was a new starting point, a phase where he had to do more, better, stronger, to not lose what he just gained. And that turned success into a new kind of pressure, a more dangerous kind, because it was no longer about trying to achieve something, but about the fear of losing it. He kept working non-stop, kept pushing himself to the limit, kept controlling every detail of his career, the way he'd learned from martial arts and his childhood. But the more he controlled, the more he felt everything could slip away at any moment, as if success wasn't truly his, but something he had to grip tightly to keep from falling. And right in the moment, the world began to see him as a new Hollywood icon. A painful paradox took shape. On the outside, he was at the peak, But on the inside, he was still that boy from the Bronx, still carrying the fear of being swallowed whole, still believing that if he weakened even a little, it would all collapse. And that very insecurity which had helped him rise was quietly laying the groundwork for the pressures and decisions that would later completely change his life. And then, when Wesley Snipes stepped into the role of Blade in the late 1990s, it wasn't just another career opportunity, it was a fateful moment that completely changed his place in film history. Because Blade wasn't just an action movie, it was a global phenomenon, a turning point that paved the way for the modern superhero era long before the world knew about the giant cinematic universes that came later. With the image of a half-human, half-vampire hunter cold, precise, and nearly unbeatable, Wesley didn't just play the part. He became Blade, an icon who was both ruthless and magnetic, bringing audiences a completely different kind of hero, especially for the black community, who for the first time saw a superhero lead a major Hollywood film, not as a side character, not as a peripheral symbol, but as the center of the entire story. And the film's success proved he wasn't just right, he was ahead of his time. Blade grossed hundreds of millions worldwide, spawned successful sequels, turned Wesley into one of the highest-grossing action stars of that era. And on the surface, everything seemed perfect: fame, power, influence, all in his hands, and Blade's unbeatable image gradually blended into his real-life persona, blurring the line between the man and the character in a dangerous way. But right there, a quiet change began to take place. A change no one could spot right away, not even him. As Wesley lived deeper and deeper into the image he'd created, an image of absolute control, of strength without weakness, of a man who never falls. And while that gave him the status he'd always craved, it also slowly stripped away his ability to let himself be vulnerable, to allow himself to make mistakes, and most importantly, to allow himself to be an ordinary human being. In the years that followed, he didn't just play Blade on screen, he seemed to carry that spirit into real life, controlling everything more tightly, closing himself off more, trusting less. And the more successful he became, the deeper he sank into a version of himself he believed he had to maintain, as if letting go even a little would make everything he'd built come crashing down. And while the world saw an unbeatable icon, a man who always stood firm against every challenge, inside a quiet exhaustion began to build, a disconnection from his true self that he didn't know how to face, because he'd spent so much time becoming an icon that he was no longer sure who he was without it. Blade gave him everything: fame, money, status, but at the same time, it took the most important thing: the freedom to be himself. Because when you become an icon of invincibility, you also lock yourself in an invisible cage, where admitting weakness is no longer an option, where mistakes are no longer allowed to exist, and where you have to keep playing that role, not just in front of the camera, but in real life, until you no longer remember what your real self was ever like. And right in that dangerous blending of man and character, reality and image, control and pressure, a quiet tragedy began to form. Not a sudden fall, but a slow process where layer after layer of his true identity was covered over. The distance from the outside world stretched further and further, and later decisions were no longer made by a whole person, but by an icon desperately trying to protect its own image at any cost. But right when everything seemed to be at its peak, when Wesley Snipes had become one of the most powerful faces in action films, another kind of pressure began to quietly emerge. The pressure to maintain that position, to keep being the top guy, to prove that his success wasn't just a fleeting moment, but a standard he could repeat over and over again. And for someone like Wesley, who was used to controlling his life, that pressure wasn't something he could share or let go of, but something he tried to manage the only way he knew how: by controlling more, working more, and not allowing any factor to slip outside his reach. He threw himself into work with increasing intensity, not just acting, but diving deep into production, editing, creative decisions, as if every tiny detail could affect the final outcome, and if he didn't hold it directly, everything could slip away. That made him extremely focused, extremely disciplined, but at the same time, it made him less approachable, more closed off, and gradually created an invisible distance between him and the people around him. On set, where it used to be a space of collaboration and creativity, things started to feel tense, as Wesley no longer easily trusted other people's decisions, as he felt the need to control everything to make sure the result met the standards he set, and that though driven by a desire for perfection made those working with him feel difficult, even pushed away. Conversations became curt, interactions grew cold, and slowly he wasn't just controlling the work, but unintentionally controlling the entire space around him, creating an environment where few people felt comfortable truly connecting. Away from the lights, his personal life began to mirror that shift too. As work time overtook everything else, relationships faded into the background, and maintaining the image of strength and invincibility became a burden he never put down. He was no longer the one seeking recognition, but the one who had to protect it. And that transition carried a loneliness no one really saw. Success, the thing he once believed would bring freedom, had now become a form of bondage, an invisible cage built from expectations, from image, and from the very standards he set for himself. And inside that cage he communicated less, shared less, opened up less, because every time he let himself open even a little, he felt like he was risking the loss of the control he'd worked so hard to build. Gradually, the world around him started to feel foreign, not because it changed, but because he had separated himself from it, step by step, small decision by small decision, until the distance grew too wide to easily close again. And the most heartbreaking part was that while everyone still saw a successful star, an icon of strength and discipline, inside Wesley was facing a completely different reality and isolation he didn't know how to escape, because the very tools that had helped him rise were now becoming the walls separating him from the world. Success, once the greatest goal of his life, had turned into a state he had to maintain at all costs, and in that process he slowly lost connections, balance, and the parts of his humanity he'd once tried to protect, until finally, standing at the peak he dreamed of, he found himself more alone than ever, surrounded by the spotlight but unable to truly touch anyone, and not letting anyone touch him. And then, when isolation had become a familiar state, the first real cracks began to show more clearly in Wesley Snipes' career, especially during the production of Blade, Trinity, the film that was supposed to be the next high point for an icon, but instead became the place where fractures no one really wanted to see before were exposed. On set, the atmosphere no longer resembled the early days of Blade, when everything ran smoothly and full of energy, but instead was filled with tension, distance, and simmering conflicts. As Wesley increasingly separated himself from the rest of the crew, no longer communicating directly with the director, but through intermediaries, as if he were building a barrier between himself and everyone around him. Not because he didn't care, but because he no longer fully trusted how things were being run. Creative decisions became sources of conflict, as Wesley wanted more control, wanted to keep the Blade character true to the image he believed was right, while others on the team had different directions, and instead of finding common ground, the gap between them grew wider bit by bit until it was no longer just differences in opinion, but a breakdown in communication. There were stories told that he spent most of his time in his trailer, limiting interactions, only appearing when needed for filming. And there were even times he communicated with the crew only through notes behaviors that from the outside could be seen as standoffish or eccentric, but in reality reflected something deeper, a man trying to hold on to control in an environment where he felt he no longer had full grip. Those behaviors, in a collaborative field like film, quickly got noticed, And Hollywood, always watching and judging, began to question not just his work ethic but his long-term ability to collaborate, whether he was still someone they could trust with big projects. And sadly, what was once seen as dedication and perfectionism was now being viewed as rigidity, as being difficult to manage, as if the very qualities that had helped him rise were now being reinterpreted in a completely different way. But amid all of that, the most dangerous thing wasn't the conflicts or the rumors. It was that these cracks weren't addressed, weren't confronted directly, but were ignored, pushed aside, as if they weren't serious enough to change anything. While in reality they were quietly spreading, digging deeper into both his career and his person. Because when someone is used to controlling everything, it's very hard for them to admit that some things are slipping out of their control, and instead of stopping to adjust, they tend to control more, close off more, and unintentionally make the problem worse. And so, while on the outside Wesley Snipes was still a big name, still an icon audiences remembered, inside the industry a different story was slowly forming. A story about being hard to work with, about unresolved tensions, about a man gradually detaching himself from the system he once conquered. And the scariest part was that none of this happened in one explosive moment, but unfolded slowly, quietly, step by step, until no one could deny that something was wrong. But by then those cracks were no longer small, and repairing them had become harder than ever. But those cracks on set were only the surface of a deeper, more dangerous process that was quietly unfolding in Wesley Snipes' life. A process that didn't begin with a collapse, but with a belief, and it was that very belief that led him off the path he'd spent his entire youth building. In the early 2000s, when he was at the height of his fame and power, Wesley began to believe in an ideology that claimed the U.S. government's tax system was illegal, that he had no obligation to follow rules he considered unjust, and for someone accustomed to controlling his own life, accustomed to rejecting what he didn't believe was right, that belief wasn't just an opinion, it became a principle he was willing to defend. He wasn't alone in this thinking, because around him were people reinforcing that belief, advisors offering complicated arguments, theories that sounded convincing, and more importantly, promises that he could keep what he'd earned without complying with a system they claimed was flawed. And in a state where he was used to making his own decisions, used to trusting his own judgment, Wesley began to follow that advice, not because he wanted to do wrong, but because he genuinely believed he was doing right. But what he didn't realize, or perhaps didn't want to face, was that warnings started coming from people with real expertise, from lawyers, from those who truly understood the legal system, people who tried to tell him this path was dangerous, that the consequences could be severe, and that belief, no matter how strong, couldn't change the reality of the law. But when a person has invested so much faith in something, especially when it aligns with how they see the world, it's very hard for them to accept information that contradicts it. And Wesley, in the very confidence that had helped him rise, began to enter a more dangerous state blindness. He was no longer just controlling his career. He was trying to control rules he couldn't change, and in that process he gradually ignored the warning signs, gradually believed he knew better than others, that he could take a different path without paying a price, and that was the turning point. Not a rash decision, but a series of small choices, each one seeming reasonable in the moment, but when combined, forming a road straight to the abyss. The heartbreaking part is that, for Wesley, this wasn't the act of recklessness or rebellion, but the result of genuine belief, a belief that he was protecting himself, that he was doing the right thing, and that's exactly why he didn't see the danger until it became irreversible. Because when you believe you're heading in the right direction, you don't stop to recheck the map, and once you've gone too far, turning back is no longer an easy option. And so, step by step, quietly, without drama, Wesley Snipes went from a man in control of his life to a man stepping into a situation he couldn't control, from an icon of strength and discipline to a person facing the consequences of decisions he once believed were right. And the scariest part is that at that point, he still hadn't realized everything he'd built was standing on the brink of total collapse. And then the moment Wesley Snipes never imagined would come, finally arrived. Not like a noisy storm, but like a door slamming shut behind him when official investigations began. When the accusations were no longer distant warnings but legal reality, and when he was indicted, brought to trial, forced to confront the system he once believed he could stand outside of. The early days of the trial weren't just a legal process. They were a public dissection, where every decision, every belief, every action of his was brought into the light, analyzed, dissected, and judged by both the law and public opinion. And in that space, Wesley was no longer a movie star, no longer Blade, no longer an icon of strength, but simply a defendant, a man standing on the verge of losing everything he'd built. The media quickly seized the story, and in a short time his image was brutally redefined when headlines no longer mentioned the hundreds of millions blockbusters or iconic roles, but revolved around one single word: criminal. And in the world of the public, where perception is often shaped by short headlines and simplified stories, Wesley Snipes was no longer a complex person with a long journey, but became an example, a cautionary tale, a name tied to mistake. People who once worked with him began to keep their distance. Not all turned their backs, but enough to create a chilling void where there had once been respect and collaboration, and Hollywood, an industry that always moves fast and rarely looks back, began looking for other faces, other names, people who could fill the spot he once held, as if his absence was just a temporary gap to be filled as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, for Wesley, this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a confrontation with himself, with the decisions he'd trusted, with the warnings he'd ignored, and with the reality that this time he couldn't control the outcome with willpower or discipline like before, because the system he was facing didn't operate by the rules he was familiar with. When the sentence was handed down, when the final words echoed in the courtroom, it wasn't just the loss of freedom. It was the moment his entire public image collapsed in one go, like a building with its foundation pulled out. No time to adapt, no chance to salvage anything, only the cold truth that from that second onward, his life would never be the same again. He was no longer a celebrated icon, but a convicted man, a name Hollywood no longer wanted attached to big projects, a person the public looked at with suspicion instead of admiration. What made that moment even more painful wasn't just the loss. It was the speed of it, the way everything changed almost instantly, from spotlight to darkness, from respect to avoidance, from a position millions dreamed of to a state no one wanted to mention. And in that shift, Wesley had no time to understand what was happening. No chance to pause and adjust, because the wheel of consequences had started rolling, and it didn't stop just because he wasn't ready. This wasn't an ordinary fall, not a failure that could be explained with simple reasons. It was a total collapse, where career, reputation, and personal image were all dragged down at once. And the scariest part was that in the eyes of the world, everything he'd ever achieved suddenly seemed to matter no more, as if his past was erased just by one mistaken present. And right in that moment, when the courtroom door closed, when the noise of the media faded, when Hollywood turned away to chase the next story, Wesley Snipes stood in a place he'd never imagined he'd reach. Not the peak, but the bottom of the abyss, where he no longer had control, no longer had an image to protect, no longer had roles to hide behind, only his real self left and the consequences he was forced to face. And that was the moment an icon wasn't just knocked down, but completely redefined, from someone the world admired to someone the world turned its back on. And when the prison door closed behind him, everything Wesley Snipes once knew about the world was immediately stripped away. No more lights, no more cameras, No more praise or respect, just a raw reality where fame had no value, power meant nothing, and the name that once drew millions of eyes was now just another name on an inmate list, a person placed in an environment where everything was decided by completely different rules, where he couldn't control the pace of life, couldn't choose his schedule, couldn't pick his surroundings or the people around him, and for someone who'd spent his entire life controlling everything, that wasn't just a change of circumstances. It was an existential shock. The early days in prison weren't loud or dramatic. They were heavy and drawn out, as time seemed to crawl slower, as every hour and every minute carried the feeling of being disconnected from the world he once belonged to, and in that silence, with no shell left to hide behind, no role left to shield him, Wesley was forced to confront himself in a way he'd never done before. Not as a star, not as an icon, but as a human being with all his choices, his mistakes, and his unavoidable consequences. The isolation didn't just come from the physical space. It came from within, as he realized that everything he'd once used to define himself, his career, his fame, his image, was no longer there, and the question, "Who am I?" stopped being some distant philosophical thought and became a daily reality he had to face every day and every night in moments when there was nothing to do but think, remember, and feel. And right in those moments, a sense of lost identity began to spread. Not the loss of a part of himself, but the realization that he no longer knew who he was without the things he'd relied on. There were days when the silence grew too loud, when there was no noise from the outside world to fill the void, when every thought echoed back at him, forcing him to see things he could once ignore, the decisions he once believed were right, the warnings he once brushed off, and the truth that it was he, and no one else, who had brought himself here. It wasn't dramatic self-blame, but a slow, painful process of awareness where layer after layer of justification was peeled away, revealing a simple but hard-to-accept truth: that control doesn't always mean being right, and belief, no matter how strong, can't substitute for reality. But in that very stillness and harshness, the things that had once helped him survive began to return, not as tools to control the world, but as ways to keep himself from falling apart. The discipline from martial arts, from those years of relentless training, became an anchor as he started rebuilding a structure for his life inside prison, from small habits, from keeping his body active, from maintaining focus, as if he were recreating a part of himself that didn't depend on any outside factor. Martial arts, which once helped him control the world, now helped him control himself, helping him hold balance in an environment where everything could make a person collapse. And day by day, though slow and heavy, he began to understand that strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing firm even when everything has already collapsed. 3 years in prison may not seem long by the outside world's measure, but for Wesley it was an endless journey where every day brought a new challenge, a new confrontation, and a small chance to understand more deeply the person he had become. And as time passed, even without the spotlight or recognition, something quietly changed. Not the restoration of fame, but the restructuring of his very self. A slow process no one saw, but more important than any role he'd ever played. Because for the first time, Wesley Snipes wasn't acting strong. He was learning to truly become strong. And then when the prison door opened, when Wesley Snipes stepped out after 3 long, seemingly endless years, he didn't step into a world waiting for his return. No flashing cameras, no welcoming words, no sense of coming back like many might imagine, but just a silence that stretched from inside the prison out into the outside world, as if his absence hadn't created a void, but had simply been filled by other things, other people, other stories. Hollywood didn't stop, didn't wait, and didn't look back to see if he was still there, because this industry always moves forward, and anyone who can't keep up gets left behind. Not out of malice, but because that's how it works. The doors that once opened easily were no longer accessible. Invitations stopped coming. Big projects no longer sought him out. And instead, there was silence, a silence. No one explained, no one acknowledged, but everyone understood. He was no longer the first choice, not even a choice at all. And that didn't happen in one dramatic moment, but over days and months that passed without a ringing phone, without scripts arriving, without meetings being scheduled, as if the world had quietly decided he was no longer needed. For someone who'd once stood at the peak, once been the center of major projects, once been spoken of as an icon, this change wasn't just a career shock, it was an attack on his identity, as he began to realize that everything he'd thought was permanent only existed while he was inside that system, and once he was pulled out, it could all vanish faster than he ever imagined. New films came out without him. New faces took the places he once held, and audiences, even unintentionally, gradually forgot the name once tied to iconic roles. Because public memory is always tied to the present. And when you no longer appear, you slowly become part of the past, a part not everyone goes back to remember. The most painful thing wasn't losing money or opportunities. It was the feeling of being erased from the story he'd helped create, as if history kept writing itself without mentioning you anymore, as if everything you'd done, built, and sacrificed was now just faint lines in the memory of a few. Wesley had to face a reality no one had prepared him for. That coming back wasn't simply walking out of prison and picking up where he left off, but starting over from a much lower point in a world that had changed, in an industry that had moved on, and in a position no longer defined by past success but by present absence. There were moments when he could look back at the past and wonder if everything he'd achieved had really existed, when the present seemed to deny it, when no one mentioned it anymore, when no one needed him anymore, and right in those moments a deep pain emerged. Not the pain of failure, but the pain of being forgotten. When you're still here, still alive, still able to work, but the world has decided you're no longer part of it. And perhaps for a man who'd spent his whole life proving his worth, rising from a place where everything was against him, being forgotten wasn't just a state. It was a wound, an unseen but smoldering wound, as he had to learn to exist not with recognition, but with silence, not with the spotlight, but with emptiness. And in that very emptiness, he had to find a reason to keep going. Not because the world needed him, but because he wasn't ready to disappear yet. And right in that emptiness, when there was nothing left to cling to except himself, Wesley Snipes was forced to face a truth he'd never imagined before. That if he wanted to keep going, he'd have to start over from zero, not as a star making a comeback after time away, but as someone new stepping into the industry, with no power, no status, no privileges, and no guarantee that the world would open its doors to him one more time. The first roles after he returned were no longer the center of big films, no longer iconic characters, but small parts, low-profile projects, opportunities he might have turned down before but now became necessary steps to rebuild his path, little by little. It wasn't a glamorous journey, no big headlines, no dramatic Hollywood comeback like the industry loves, but a slow, quiet process where every role, no matter how small, carried a bigger meaning, not to reclaim fame, but to prove he could still work, still contribute, and still wasn't finished. He was no longer the one making demands. He became the one accepting chances. He was no longer the center of every decision. He became part of a team, and that shift, though hard, gave him a new perspective, as he began to understand that his worth wasn't only in the position he once held, but in the ability to get back up and keep going, even when no one was waiting. Humility didn't come as a choice. It came as a natural consequence of what he'd been through, when he no longer needed to prove who he was, no longer needed to protect a perfect image, but just needed to do well what was right in front of him, day by day. step by step, the same way he'd done as a boy learning to survive in a harsh environment. And right in that return, something familiar started to reappear. Survival mode. The state he'd learned very early in life when nothing was guaranteed, when every step required focus, and when survival mattered more than anything else. But this time, survival mode wasn't a reaction to outside chaos, it was a conscious choice, a way for him to hold himself steady in a changed world he no longer controlled, but could still find a place in if he was patient enough, disciplined enough, and resilient enough. He stopped chasing the spotlight and focused on the work, stopped seeking instant recognition, and accepted the long haul. And in that silence, a quiet rebirth took place. Not the return of an icon, but the formation of a new person who understood his limits better, his mistakes better, and the real value of just keeping moving forward. This isn't the story of a flashy comeback. It's the story of a man who refused to stop, refused to disappear even when every condition pushed him toward that, and in every small role, every scarce opportunity, Wesley Snipes is rewriting his story. Not with roaring successes, but with a persistence no one can see, a quiet persistence strong enough to keep him standing, even when the world no longer looks his way. And as the quiet restart became familiar, as those small steps no longer felt forced, but turned into a new rhythm of life, Wesley Snipes also began entering another phase of his life, no longer centered on being seen, but on living more fully, a life he'd never really had the chance to experience before, amid the pressures of fame and the need to control everything. Family life became a central but private part, not flaunted or shaped for media as an image to build, but a personal space where he could be himself without playing a role, without performing, without proving anything to anyone. After everything, from the peak to the fall, from the spotlight to the silence, Wesley was no longer the man who had to chase recognition, who had to hold tight to an unbeatable icon image, but someone who understood that his value didn't lie in how the world saw him, but in how he existed when no one was watching. This maturity didn't come from success. It came from loss, from what he'd lost and what he was forced to relearn, from realizing that control doesn't always bring safety, that sometimes letting go is the only way to hold on to what truly matters. He no longer needed to prove who he was, no longer needed to stand at the top to feel worthy. And that brought a kind of freedom he'd never had before. Freedom from the pressure to be perfect, from the fear of losing what he had, from the need to maintain an image he once thought was essential. Instead, he began to see life differently, slower, deeper, truer when things once taken for granted became precious, when simple family moments carried more meaning than any applause, and when peace no longer had to be sought outside, but could be felt from within. The paradox is that the biggest losses helped him understand what really matters, as he realized fame can vanish, money can run out, status can be replaced, but his true self, if built on honesty and acceptance, no one can take away. And in that realization, a quiet peace gradually formed. Not the peace of a perfect life, but the peace of someone who'd been through enough not to be swept away by fleeting things anymore. Someone who learned to live without needing to prove. Someone who'd accepted that the past can't be changed, but the future can still be shaped by small daily choices. This isn't a glamorous ending, it's a state of balance he paid a very high price to reach, where he's no longer defined by what he lost, but by how he keeps living after losing everything. And in that silence, with no more pressure, no more world watching, Wesley Snipes finally found what he'd been searching for his whole life, not victory, but peace. And when looking back at the entire journey from a boy growing up on the harsh streets of the Bronx to an action icon dominating Hollywood, then falling to the depths of mistake and being forgotten, Wesley Snipes doesn't emerge as a perfect story, but as a real human being. Someone who reached the top, made mistakes, paid the price, and had to learn to stand up in a world that no longer waited for him. He's not a flawless role model, not someone who always made the right choices, but proof of a hard-to-accept truth that even the strongest can veer off course, can lose everything just because of a chain of choices they believed were right. But what keeps his story from ending in tragedy isn't that he avoided consequences. It's that he didn't let those consequences define his ending. Because after everything, when fame faded, when status was replaced, when the world moved on without him, Wesley Snipes is still here, still moving forward, still working, still existing. And that very existence, quiet, persistent, without fanfare, is the real legacy he leaves behind. It's not box office numbers, not iconic roles, but the story of a man who refused to disappear even when every condition pushed him toward it. A man who accepted his past without denying or running from it, but used it as a foundation to keep living, to keep moving forward, slower, with less light, but more real than ever. And perhaps in a world that always celebrates wins and quickly forgets losses, his story carries a different message. Not flashy, but deeper. That a person's worth isn't in whether they ever fall, but in what they do after losing everything. That true strength isn't never collapsing, but the ability to stand up when no one's cheering, when there's nothing left to prove, and when even you aren't sure you can keep going. And so, when the lights go out, when the noise dies down, when the world moves to other stories, the image of Wesley Snipes is no longer an unbeatable icon, but a human who walked through darkness and chose not to stop a painful but dignified journey where respect doesn't come from perfection, but from the ability to endure. And in that endurance he not only saved himself but left a mark time can hardly erase. The story of Wesley Snipes doesn't just make people feel regretted, stirs a deep sorrow when seeing a man who rose from the harsh South Bronx, where he had to learn survival early, then built a career step by step with martial arts discipline and unbreakable will, reaching the peak with Blade, an unbeatable icon, but that very unbeatable image quietly isolated him, causing him to lose connection with the world and start believing he could control everything, even systems no one can stand outside of, like the law. And when he believed in wrong ideas about taxes, ignored warnings from lawyers, the tragedy didn't hit right away, but built up until it fully collapsed in the courtroom, where an icon became a defendant, and then 3 years in prison. No fame, no power, just the real man facing his own mistakes. What makes this story even more heartbreaking isn't the fall itself, but the time after he walked out, when Hollywood moved on without him, when big roles vanished, and when a name that once ruled the screen fell into being forgotten, as if history quietly erased him from its pages. But right at that lowest point, when he started again with small, humble, quiet roles, the survival mode from childhood came back, helping him keep walking, not to reclaim the spotlight, but to hold on to himself. For American audiences, where success and individualism are always celebrated, this story is a powerful reminder that discipline and will can take a person to the top, but without clarity and the ability to listen, those same qualities can push them into the abyss. At the same time, it shows that a person's true value isn't in whether they ever fail, but in how they face failure. Stand up after losing everything, and keep living responsibly and meaningfully even when the world has turned its back. If Wesley Snipes' journey of rising again after losing everything makes you reflect, please hit subscribe to the channel to join us in more deep and real stories behind Hollywood's glamour. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore people who didn't disappear even when life tried to erase them.